to help struggling math students transform into math heroes. This is the last of our 8 webinar series for this school year. I am Sarah Sum, a Technical Assistance Coordinator from the Wisconsin RTI Center, and I am going to be facilitating today's session. Joining me today from the Wisconsin RTI Center is Heidi Erstad. She's going to be monitoring the chat box and answering questions as they may come up. Just so that you do know, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the RTI Center YouTube channel and website, along with the presentations that are shared today. We will email you the link to access these after today's session. Also, in full disclosure, we're hoping for this session to be more interactive than the previous sessions. We appreciate your willingness to stay engaged and participate in hopes of creating some networking opportunities for you throughout today's session. Jumping into today, I just want to share our series outcomes. Here are the outcomes for the 8 webinar series. Today, we're really going to be building in time to connect with practitioners across the state. We really look forward to hearing from you and hearing about how you plan to improve your school's mathematics interventions for all kids. In previous webinars, we've discussed the role of screening, motivational strategies, content, instructional practices, fact fluency, progress monitoring, and effective design and delivery. Today we will talk more about what it actually means to intervene. I'll be providing you with some critical points to a culturally responsive multi-level system of support. We're also going to be briefly summarizing the previous topics as well as building in opportunities for you as participants to share out your progress and discuss the next steps in your schools and districts and what you are doing to improve your continuum of support for students in the area of mathematics. So beginning with our agenda, we're going to start with that overview of a culturally responsive multi-level system of support, focusing in on the critical points. As you work to strengthen your support for all students in the area of mathematics, we at the Wisconsin RTI Center have a tool called the School-Wide Implementation Review, otherwise known as the SIR. The SIR is an academic self-assessment focusing on either mathematics or reading. It's used by schools to evaluate system implementation around the Wisconsin RTI framework. The SIR is available to schools at no cost. The SIR really helps you to operationalize the Wisconsin RTI framework into actionable items so that you can then use that information for annual action planning. It's available to help school teams localize that framework and also serves to provide schools with an instrument to monitor their annual progress towards full RTI implementation. It's recommended that schools complete the SIR in order to determine their baseline RTI implementation. Schools then should plan to retake the SIR annually to monitor their progress. The SIR should be completed by school leadership teams that include a building administrator. If you are interested in learning more about the SIR, please feel free to contact either myself or Heidi Erstad. I also want to point out that the SIR print copy of the SIR is available for you in the materials section if you have not taken the SIR and would like to dig a bit deeper into those specific line items. This graphic is probably a graphic that's not new to any of you who are participating in today's webinar, but it really represents the RTI framework in our state. The elements of collaboration, balanced assessment, and high-quality instruction are infused in each and every level of support, and those culturally responsive practices are in the heart of all that we do. We do know that our webinars have really focused in on interventions at that selected and intensive level. However, we need to realize and remind ourselves that that most important level is that universal level of instruction for all students. Often when we think about RTI, we jump right into the intervention part. So we included this quote from the RTI Action Network as a reminder to us all that we're talking about an RTI framework. And in this framework, all students have access to the universal level. If we don't address the universal level first, we're missing the opportunity to create the biggest impact on student achievement. Other levels of support for students who are struggling must come from and support success at the universal level. Knowing that the universal level is critical, we also want to dig a little bit deeper into what it really truly means to intervene with students. This definition about intervention comes to us from the Department of Public Instruction. Intervention means the systematic use of a technique, practice, or program designed and shown to improve learning in specific areas of student need. It's important that I just want to break this down a little bit for you. Choosing interventions is part of a process within a collaborative, multi-level system of support. Designing interventions is intentional, individualized, and guided by multiple sources of information that clearly identify the factors affecting student learning. To be effective, our interventions must match student need and address factors affecting learning. Some factors affecting student learning may be academic, social, emotional, environmental, cultural, and possibly even other causes. When we refer to systematic, we're referring to a consistent, predetermined decision rule or rules that guide the planning, the implementation, and evaluation of the intervention. Up next are the critical points within selected and intensive levels of support. The critical points of implementation is really where it's easy to go astray. In fact, Richter 4 refers to these finer points or these critical points as dangerous detours and seductive shortcuts. Many of the critical points are places where it's easy to think, we have the technical change pieces in place, so we're ready to go. However, these are often points where you need to think of those adaptive changes in order to ensure the technical changes are effective. Critical point number 1 is that the RTI framework begins with the implementation and delivery of a strong universal level. You may have heard the saying that you cannot intervene your way out of Tier 1. You also may have heard folks complain that RTI is all about interventions. We understand the confusion as the I in RTI stands for intervention. You also may have heard schools and professionals change that letter I in the acronym to mean instruction, or I squared, meaning instruction and intervention. The framework agrees that Wisconsin has created RTI with a golden ring, which represents those multiple levels of support. And first and foremost, that most important level is the universal level, which is instruction that all students receive. We also know that this effective framework requires more than just universal instruction. We know that in any school setting, we will have students coming into school and experiencing school with different background knowledge, different experiences, varying beliefs, skills, and styles. Our job is to provide students with the supports to learn and grow. For some of our students, more than just the universal level of support is necessary, temporarily or periodically, so they can achieve and reach our expectations. To implement this framework, we must create those multiple levels or safety nets to make sure that we're giving equitable access to all of our students. But even with strong universal levels of supports, some students will still need additional support in order to be successful, and a few of our students will need those intensive supports to be successful. Yet we do not want to base the success of each and every student on the notion that universal instruction and support will be sufficient for all. If the top is well designed and implemented, the numbers needing early intervention are reduced, and if the subsystem for early intervention is well designed and implemented, fewer of our students will need those more intensive interventions. Critical point number 2 refers to the fact that this framework requires the thoughtful organization or reorganization of resources into a school-wide continuum of supports for students in instruction, collaboration, and assessment. And that this organization of resources includes all levels of support and includes all staff into one system rather than separate siloed systems. The statement on the slide, RTI does not mean refer to interventionist, may initially offend those of you who may have a defined role as an interventionist. The purpose of this slide is to provoke thought and to reinforce the fact that this multi-level system of support framework requires the placement of resources in a connected continuum of supports throughout the building, not a new way to silo or to categorize students and or staff. This means it takes more than those very valuable interventionists to create a school-wide system of support. It takes all staff, including interventionists if you have them, and the community to create and deliver this framework, this multi-level system of support. want you to think for just a second here about what these phrases may mean within your system if we are looking to break down some of those silos and looking at creating a system of support for students. So thinking, if we do say these phrases, what is their meaning behind them, and what does that really say about the system that we're creating for all students? I want you to think on this next slide about a system. And think, we want to move from this system of offering fragmented services. And I want you to think system, and this comes to us from a brief from this, we can actually list the site later, but from the school psych research, because it states that because of the long-standing marginalization of student and learning supports, the resources and leadership dedicated to supporting such work continues to be fragmented, often with costly redundancy and counterproductive competition for sparse resources, and always producing too limited outcomes. So we want to move away from these counterproductive competition for resources that are already limited within our schools, and move to a more fluid continuum system of support for all of our students, where all of our students are receiving the supports that they need to be successful in school and also to be successful back in the universal level. We also want you to think about, what does that continuum of supports look like? Here's what is meant by one system with a continuum of supports. The green on the screen represents that universal level of support, and the yellow and red represent the fluid, selected, and intensive levels. On one side, you should be visualizing that highest performing student in your school, and on the other end, think about who is struggling the most to perform on the other. RTI is really about leveraging your school's resources and expertise to ensure that each of those kids and all of the students in between grow and succeed. Critical point number 3 really talks about cultural responsiveness extending through each and all of the levels of support within your system. Being culturally responsive does not just exist when we are providing strong universal level of instruction. As we build a systematic system of support, we must make sure we are embedding culturally responsive practices to ensure all students have success in our system. When we talk more about what are those culturally responsive practices, we're really talking about the degree to which a school's programs, practices, procedures, and policies account for and adapt to the broad diversity of students' race and culture. This is really what helps you to localize your system. When we talk about this cultural competence model, I'm just going to go a little bit in depth with you so we have a better understanding of this cultural competence model. It's really important that we know that there is an urgency for change within our state. Schools must change, not because they're broken, but because we must respond to the demographic shifts in society that have caused changes in the student population and in the needs of the students and the families that we serve. Despite good intentions and efforts of individual educators and school systems across our state, there are broad K-12 achievement gaps continue to persist. Indeed, the gaps between our white students and our students of color are among the worst in the nation. The urgency to act is now for the benefit of all students attending our schools in our state, including nearly 50,000 English learners, over 100,000 students with disabilities, 250,000 students of color, and more than 350,000 students receiving free and reduced lunch. This cultural competence model is a journey, and it describes the beliefs, the knowledge, and practices Wisconsin educators, schools, and districts need to more effectively reach and teach diverse students within a culturally responsive multi-level system of support. This process is represented on the outer circle of the graphic as the will, the feel, and the skill. The will is that desire to lead and the commitment to do the work. The feel is gaining cultural knowledge about ourselves and others. And lastly, the skill is when we begin to apply that knowledge and skillfully put beliefs and learning into action. The arrows around the circle are intended to illustrate the ongoing, unfinished nature of this work. Developing cultural competence is a lifelong journey and not a final destination. It involves developing a way of being and knowing that shows up in one's way of doing. For those of us who belong to the dominant race or culture in particular, this journey involves an intentional choice to stay engaged in initially uncomfortable introspection, embracing alternative truths, and ensuring that every student is successful. We are going to pause here for 2 minutes, and I want you to think about just a reflection of a think and share. So first, I'd like you to think about those critical points that we've heard, and think about what squares with your thinking, and do a silent celebration. And then I want you to think of what's a new way of thinking about a particular idea or something that you may be excited to learn more about. And then lastly, what might be still a conflicting concept for you that you're hoping to resolve through additional growth and reflection. So I'd like you to take 1 minute to reflect on your own, and then we'll take another minute to add your reflections in the chat box. All right, welcome back. Thank you for taking some time to just do some reflection on the first three critical points. As we move on, we're going to move into critical point 4, which really focuses in on one size does not fit all. We know that in education, one size does not fit all. But however, in a multi-level system of support, I want to just dig a little bit deeper into this theoretical model of RTI. In a multi-level system of support, 100% of students access the universal level or Tier 1 of support. As student outcome data shows that they need additional support, students are then provided effective interventions at a selected or a Tier 2 level, or even more support at an intensive or Tier 3 level. Students receive layered effective interventions linked directly back to what's occurring at the universal level. We use these percentages on the screen as a theoretical gauge of the health of your system. RTI research has shown that if your system is effective and efficient and focused on prevention and high quality differentiation, about 80 to 90% of your students should be successful or be at benchmark with universal Tier 1 support alone. Typically, the research has shown that then an additional 5 to 15% requires supports above and beyond the reach of the universal level. If we know our population of students well, we can usually predict and plan in advance for the types of support students will need at this selected or Tier 2 support. And then there's the students that keep you awake at night. Typically, that's 1 to 5% of your students who need supports well above and beyond the universal. That's the intensive or tier 3 level of support. Here we're thinking about individualized plans of support that could be a combination of academic, behavioral, social, emotional supports that require significant expertise to understand and plan for. Again, the goal of our system is that 100% of our students have access and have success at the universal level. But we know that that is not always the case. So how do we create that system of supports so that all of our students can have what they need in order to be successful? Again, this graphic illustrates that the 80-15-5 rule does not always fit with what's needed at every school. As you can see, that 80-15-5 rule does not apply to the needs of School A or to the needs of School B. So thinking about how can we provide supports, again, to meet the needs of all of our students. That 80-15-5 is a model, and I just want to dig a little bit deeper into that again. Much like the word intervention, in the acronym RTI, it creates misinterpretation and confusion. And we also seem to find the same occurring again with that 80-15-5 percentage rule that's often included with the triangle like we saw in the slide prior. This critical point is important as we find some misinterpretation that a school must intervene for 15% of their students, despite what their data says, or that they're reaching 80%, or that reaching 80% at the universal level is a goal. We really want to make sure that we are not looking at this 80-15-5 as a hammer. There's no mandate for 3 tiers. I want you to think about a multi-level system of support instead. I also want you not to think about that 80-15-5 as a saw. Students should not be denied supports they need in order to be successful at the universal level. And again, our goal with our system, with our schools, is 100% of success for all of our students. Critical point number 5 really talks about what you call things matters. It's really important that we think about the use of our terms or vocabulary and what we really call things in our building. We found that in order to be systemic and even systematic in how we respond and support students and parents, what we call things does indeed matter. Having a common term and, more importantly, a common understanding of that term makes a difference in implementation and therefore the outcomes for our students. It's very important that we have clear and agreed upon definitions for common terms, especially those terms with multiple meanings. So I want you to look at these terms on the screen, and I just want you to take time as I'm reading through this to just ponder how could these terms contradict the framework. Excuse me. Sorry about this. I want you to think about the terms that are on the screen, and I want you to think about how these terms can contradict the vision of the framework for RTI in our state. Then I want you to think about how can the use of these terms unintentionally perpetuate the silos and the segregation and labeling of students and staff, therefore breaking down our one continuum or our one system of support. It's also important that we make sure that we are labeling the levels of support and not people. So we know that students come to us with a range of skills and needs. In this example, we have a student who's proficient after the universal level of instruction in science, in attendance, and in hallway behavior. But this young man, Dion, needs additional support in PE and language arts. He needs intensive support in reading and intensive support in math. In this case, he may need a replacement or accelerated curriculum in mathematics. The point being, kids come to us with both strengths and challenges. We can't label Dion a Tier 3 student. That fixed label on him doesn't help us meet his needs or recognize his potential to grow. RTI is not about creating another label for kids or for rooms that we send kids to. It's about changing our system to support learners. We caution schools to check their language. Make sure that you are labeling your services, not students or staff. By labeling students, we're assigning them a permanent condition about who they are versus the student or the supports that they are receiving. The last critical point really is about keeping the SLD eligibility rule in perspective. The question of does it count is not as important as the question of what does this student need. The weight of this mandate can distort the systems and practices. Don't create your entire system around 2 to 4% of students. Remember that RTI is intended as a system of supports, not as a pathway to a referral. It's really important that you start the conversation about the SLD eligibility rule with a variety of professionals and within a collaborative setting in your school. The intersection of intensive level of supports and the SLD eligibility rule will likely require a difficult but necessary dialogue among highly qualified professionals with very different perspectives. At that moment, keep in mind that the data should guide the decisions, involve your experts, and plan in advance to make sure that you are setting up the best support for the student in need. So we've just finished up with the 6 critical points as you see on your screen. I would like you to just take another minute to think about, again, silently on your own, what are some celebrations that you can think of or what squares with your thinking, what may be one new idea or way of thinking, and if there's something that is still a conflicting concept for you, please also think just a little bit deeper about that. I'll give you 2 minutes to process this, and please put your comments in the chat box. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to pull you back together again. Thank you to those of you who are sharing out some of your comments in the chat box. Please do note that we are using this as a networking session to kind of celebrate and to see and to hear what others are doing across the state. So as we move forward today, we're just going to kind of do a summary of the previous 7 webinars that we've had this year. As we go through this summary, we are going to be intentional about building in some reflection questions, which will allow for some sharing and networking for you all as participants. So intervening in mathematics has been obviously the topic of our 8 webinar series. First, we're going to be talking about the screening process. And the recommendation from the IES guide is to screen all students and those who are at risk for not reaching benchmark in mathematics. But what does it mean to have a universal screening process? Screening is a critical step when establishing a continuum of support to meet the needs of students. Screening is a process, it is not a test. Effective screening systems consider every student in the school at regular intervals. We also want to honor multiple forms and sources of data in our decision-making process. The purpose of this process is to help us determine whether and which kids are on track to meet the outcomes we have in mind for them, which kids are not on track, and which kids have already exceeded our expectations. And beyond the use of this process for individual students, we can also use this process to take a look at our system as a whole. Our leadership teams can use screening data to help gauge the overall health of our universal level of instruction. As you may be aware, screening has been around in elementary schools for some time and has quite a solid research base. The research about screening at the elementary level is now more around refining and streamlining those practices. At the elementary level, we need to predict students at risk for mathematics difficulties. At the secondary level, we're drawing more from what's emerging as promising practices in screening. Generally, by the secondary level, math difficulties are well established, so we can use existing data to universally screen from 4th grade and up. In particular, we are drawing from the work at the National Center on RTI as well as the National High School Center, which really talks about using your existing data, such as the use of early warning systems, to identify what students are at risk for dropout or at risk for not meeting benchmark in mathematics. So now we'd like you to just stop and think. And we'd like you to take a second and put your answers to these prompts on the screen in the chat box. So stop and think. Are decision rules specific and consistent around classrooms in your districts and schools? What materials and procedures will be used to establish your systematic screening process? And lastly, what will happen if too many children perform below the criterion during the screening groups or screening process? And what about those particular subgroups of students? Are you beginning to disaggregate your data? So what we'll do is we'll start with 2 minutes and we'll see how that goes for just some conversation within the chat box. Thank you, Lori. I see that you were just pondering those questions and thinking about the importance of using those questions with your district team this summer. We do have more recommendations or further suggestions for you as you dig deeper into that screening process with your school or district. And I know Heidi or myself would be absolutely willing to support you and your district as you move forward in that. So please let us know how we can continue to support all of you as you embark on improving your mathematics support for all students. Next, we're going to take a look at those motivational strategies. According to the IES guide, we are to include motivational strategies within our intervention. Here are the characteristics of mathematicians. So as part of a recent U.S. Department of Ed study, researchers asked mathematicians and math grad students to describe what it means to solve problems as a mathematician. The list you can see on the screen is a categorized summary of their responses. I want you, as we move forward and think about motivational strategies, I want you to keep this list in mind and think about how your interventions can help support students believing in themselves as doers of mathematics. When we consider the topic of motivation in math interventions, we first need to take into consideration the perception of math within the general public. Here, the authors of NCTM's Principles to Action note their concern that far too many students view mathematics as something that is far beyond their grasp, or that doing math is for mathematical geniuses only. But if our students struggle with math as it is presented in school, over time, they're going to find ways to disengage with the content in order to avoid feeling failure. This fear, lack of confidence, and avoidance is most poignantly experienced by our older students who struggle, as well as by students who have been historically underserved within our schools. However, the good news is that there are powerful known things we can do to build and rebuild students' beliefs in their mathematical abilities to their original condition, the way they were when our students first entered school. And for our younger kiddos, we can build these practices in from the start so that students aren't fighting those dual battles of low confidence along with weak skills or strategies later down the road. Here we've identified multiple research-based strategies that can be used to create the conditions for motivating students and promoting the development of their mathematical selves. There are two categories that we have organized conditions for motivating students: direct and indirect. By direct, we mean the strategies that you can see in a lesson plan and observe directly in a classroom. The indirect strategies are also observable and intentional, but go deeper into belief systems and the learning culture. So using motivational strategies, what are you currently doing in your district and our schools to create conditions for motivating students both in interventions and at the universal level? And again, we'll give you just a minute to jot your answers down into the chat box. As we come back together, I do want to thank the people who are putting just some suggestions of what you're doing in your schools and districts for building in those motivational strategies. And it looks like a lot of people are using effective descriptive feedback as a way to continue to motivate students. Also really focusing in on student growth as a way to continue to motivate students. So thank you again for sharing out on that. As we move next, we're going to talk a little bit about content, and when we set up our interventions, what should we be focusing our interventions on? But before we really get into the content, we must first understand the importance of developing conceptual understanding. Conceptual understanding refers to an integrated and functional grasp of mathematical ideas. Students with conceptual understanding know more than just isolated facts and methods. They understand why a mathematical idea is important, and they also know the kinds of contexts in which it's useful. They've organized their knowledge into a coherent whole, which enables them to learn new ideas by connecting those ideas to what they already know. Conceptual understanding also supports retention. Because the facts and methods learned with understanding are connected, they are easier to remember and to use, and they can more likely be reconstructed when forgotten. Conceptual understanding refers to an integrated and functional grasp of mathematical ideas. Really, in a nutshell, students who have conceptual understanding can comprehend and connect concepts, operations, and relations. Number sense involves the ability to count meaningfully and also to understand the relationships among numbers. Specific choices for the content of interventions will depend on the grade level and the proficiency of the student, but the focus for struggling students should be on whole numbers. For example, in kindergarten through grade 2, intervention materials would typically include significant attention to counting, number composition, and number decomposition. To be engaged with quantities greater than 10, it's imperative that students develop an understanding of place value in the base 10 system. Intervention should cover the meaning of addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division, including knowledge of the properties of operations. And also, we should make sure that we focus our interventions exclusively on properties of whole numbers and operations in grades K through 5 as students get older. In grades 4 through 8, we know that fractions present one of the greatest challenges that our students encounter. NAEP test results reveal that American students have consistently struggled with basic fraction concepts. Understanding fraction concepts is a prerequisite to meaningful computation of fractions and fractions as fundamental for understanding decimals, percents, ratios, and proportions. Students eventually need to understand the relationship between a fraction, a percent, and a decimal. So content, what to intervene on. Is your intervention content aligned with the recommendations from the IES guide and the focused priorities of the Common Core? If there is alignment, how did you go to accomplish that? And if there is not alignment, what might you do to ensure alignment in the future? Again, we'll give you just a minute to get those comments down in the chat box. Okay, thank you again for those of you who are continuing to utilize that chat box as a method of communication between the participants. Up next is really as we move forward in summarizing our previous webinars, we're going to be talking about explicit and systematic instruction using visual images, feedback, and discourse. Why representations? Mathematics requires representations. In fact, because of the abstract nature of mathematics, people have access to mathematical ideas only through the representations of those ideas. Not understanding the relationship between visual representations and mathematical symbols and notations is a problem. According to the National Research Council, representations provide our gateway to understanding abstract mathematical ideas. The use of visual representations in instruction has multiple benefits for our students learning math. First, the representations can provide students with ways to access abstract ideas. While this is certainly good for all learners, it's particularly useful as a universal design for learning strategy for students with learning disabilities or for whom English is a second language. If a student cannot read or understand spoken English, visual representations help students immensely in learning the content that is presented to them. Visual representations can also support students as they communicate their mathematical reasoning, which is an important standard of mathematics practice. This communication also provides teachers with a window into students' thinking and helps peer discourse as well. When multiple representations are used, such as a visual with a verbal, student learning is deepened. Transfer of learning is more likely too because students are asked to make connections between a variety of concepts. Instruction during the intervention should be explicit and systematic. And I also want to back that up, that instruction should be explicit and systematic throughout all of the levels of support within your system. So the characteristics of systematic and explicit instruction. Back in 2008, the National Mathematics Advisory Panel defined explicit instruction as shown here on the screen. They specify that teachers need to provide clear models for solving problem types using an array of examples. This helps students generalize learning across setting and helps them to make connections among mathematical ideas. The panel also noted that students need to have extensive practice using newly learned strategies and skills, along with opportunities to think aloud or talk through the decisions they make and the steps they take as they are problem solving. Finally, students need to be provided with extensive feedback through to validate their learning and to build new understandings. The panel recommends that struggling students receive explicit instruction regularly to help them develop the foundational skills and conceptual knowledge necessary for understanding their grade level mathematics. More on explicit instruction. So what it is and what it isn't. It is actively engaging students. It's integrating smaller learning units into more meaningful wholes. It's ensuring students are deriving meaning from instruction. And it's tailoring the learning specifically to students' learning and attentional needs. It is not just skill and drill. It's not rote. It's not just used to teach isolated facts, basic skills, or procedures. And it does not teach skills in isolation from meaningful contexts. There are some differences between explicit instruction and direct instruction. Explicit instruction seeks to understand and capitalize how incoming information is processed and organized by the learner. Up next, we're going to talk a little bit about fact fluency within an intervention. And according to the research from the IES Practice Guide, they suggested that interventions should devote a percentage of time, about 5 to 10 minutes in each session, to build that fluent retrieval of basic arithmetic facts. So we really want to talk about, as we talk about fluency, we want to talk about what it is to have procedural fluency. Students who have procedural fluency can be flexible when using procedures to solve problems. The goal with procedural fluency is that students are able to be computational thinkers. They're accurate, they can produce an accurate answer, they're efficient, and they have the ability to choose an appropriate strategy for a specific problem, and that they're flexible. They have the ability to use number relationships with ease in computation. Procedural fluency refers to the knowledge of procedures, knowledge of when and how to use them appropriately, and skill in performing them flexibly, accurately, and efficiently. The goal for all of our students is to have fluency with understanding. There are those 3 elements of fluency that I briefly touched on the other slide. And there's been research done about what it means to be efficient, accurate, and flexible within fluency. Efficiency implies that children do not get bogged down in too many steps or lose track of the logic of the strategy. An efficient strategy is one that the student can carry out easily, keep track of it, and make use during intermediate and making use of intermediate results to solve the problem. Accuracy depends on several aspects of the problem-solving process, among them careful recording, knowledge of number facts and other important relationships, and also the ability to double-check their results. Flexibility requires the knowledge of more than one approach to solve a particular kind of problem, such as 2-digit multiplication. Students need to be flexible in order to choose an appropriate strategy for the numbers involved, and also be able to use one method to solve a problem and possibly even another method to check the results. Teachers across the United States ask students to memorize multiplication facts and sometimes addition and subtraction facts too, usually because the curriculum standards have specified that the students need to be quote-unquote fluent with numbers. Research from Fosnot and Dolk defines fluency as knowing how a number can be composed and decomposed, and using that information to be flexible and efficient with solving problems. Whether or not we believe fluency requires more than the recall of math facts, research evidence points in one direction. The best way to develop fluency with numbers is to develop number sense and to work with numbers in different ways, not to blindly memorize without number sense. So fluency demands more of students than memorizing a single procedure. They need to understand why they are doing what they are doing, and know when it is appropriate to use different methods. As we think about what it means to be fluent, it's a helpful parallel to think about what it means to be fluent in literacy. As educators, we may want to mirror some of those effective practices that are essential in a literacy classroom. For example, in early grades, do we time how fast a child can recite the alphabet? No. That isn't best practice and would just create undue stress and anxiety for a child. In order to be successful in literacy, students should have memorized the meanings of many different words, but no student would say that English is about fast memorization and fast recall of words. That's because we learn words by using them in many different situations, by talking, reading, and writing. English teachers do not give students hundreds of words to memorize and then test them under timed conditions. All subjects require the memorization of some facts, but mathematics is the only subject in which teachers believe they should be tested under timed conditions. Why do we treat mathematics this way? People will argue that mathematics is all about getting the correct answers, not interpretation or meaning. That is wrong. Math is about reasoning, thinking through, and sense-making. Why do we do this in mathematics? Fluency is not timed tests, memorization, teaching in isolation. We must dispel the notion that to be good in math equates to being fast in math. Joe Bowler states that learning is a process that takes time and cannot be accelerated by methods that encourage speed at the expense of understanding. In your schools, think about what do we value. Do we value speed or do we value learning? So now is your time to just debrief and think about the things that we've just reviewed. So how aligned are you and your districts and schools to ensuring that you have systematic and explicit instruction while embedding fact fluency and visual representations? So how aligned are your schools and districts to ensuring systematic and explicit instruction while embedding fact fluency and visual representations? And again, we'll give you about a minute to put some things into the chat box. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, in the interest of time, we are going to move forward into the last piece about monitoring progress in an intervention. It's important that we really first start by talking about what is progress monitoring, and knowing that progress monitoring is a process used to measure student responsiveness to interventions or additional challenges, and to evaluate the effectiveness of interventions and additional challenges. Specifically, a progress monitoring process helps us to answer these questions. The first three questions on the screen are about individuals or groups of students, and the last question on the screen is really addressing your system. This slide provides a broad outline of what progress monitoring entails and can be used when communicating the idea that progress monitoring is more than a tool and some graphs. It's a process that requires collaborative decision-making for each step along the way. This slide comes to us from the Department of Public Instruction, and we just want to share this slide about continuum of services in general education and how it relates to progress monitoring. Sometimes when we get into conversations about RTI and interventions and progress monitoring, listeners can jump right into thinking about setting up systems that meet the requirement of the specific learning disability rule. This slide helps us look at interventions and progress monitoring for a system perspective as a continuum of services. We see that at the universal level, schools have a great deal of flexibility and local control over the instructional practices and the frequency of and measures used to monitor progress. This flexibility extends into Tier 2 or the selected levels of supports. It's not until we consider the most intensive level of instruction that we want to think more prescriptively and formally about the intensity of our interventions and the type and frequency progress monitoring measures so that they are consistent with what's required in the SLD rule. In other words, the SLD eligibility rule has a role in our continuum of supports, but we want to keep it in perspective and not let it define our entire system. Progress monitoring in an RTI system truly is quick, simple, and sensitive. It should give us a measure of how our students are responding. It should give us a frequent comparison of current to desired performance over a specific period of time. It's typically used for our students receiving selected and intensive levels of support, and the frequency of it increases with the intensity of an intervention or an additional challenge. There's a wide variety of needs within your school. Just like one instructional strategy does not meet the needs of all students, one progress monitoring measure will not meet the needs of all students. Developing a continuum of progress monitoring measures is essential for your system. So lastly, we'll give you 1 minute to just jot these down. What structures do you have in place to monitor progress in your schools or districts? Who's at the table? And what tools are you currently using to monitor progress for students? All right, ladies and gentlemen, as we come back, again, I want to thank you for using the chat box as a way to network with others and to get some of your questions answered. I do just want to... I am very sorry about that, as we all have to be flexible within our schools. We also have to be flexible with extenuating circumstances or other phones ringing within our offices. So sorry about that. But I just want to, as I've been monitoring this chat box, I do want to let you know that both Heidi and I are here to continue to support your schools and your districts as you move forward. And if there are other questions, we are still taking your input and trying to develop another way to continue to support you as we move into next year. So a lot of this information that's coming up in the chat box will be very useful to us as we determine what are the needs across the state for next year. So as we head into that reflection and resources, I just want to remind you of a couple of things. All of the resources or additional research articles or previous webinars are all found on our YouTube channel. So please feel free to go back and access that if you want to dig deeper into any of the specific topics. Given the time, I do want to just do a couple of things for closing out. I do want to let you know that we do value your input and your ideas, and we want to take some of that input to determine what we are going to do for next year and how we're going to be able to continue to support mathematics within our state for all of the schools that we work with. So we are asking that we will be sending out an evaluation of the webinars later this week. We do ask that you take the time, probably about 5 to 10 minutes, and just complete that so it gives us a good perspective on what your perceptions were of the webinar, how helpful they were, areas that we can continue to grow to better meet your needs, and it will also give us more purpose and more intent for the work that we want to do next year with the schools. So again, in looking at the time, I know that it is 10 o'clock. So if there are any other questions, we will stay on the line. If there are not questions, thank you again for finding the time to participate with us today, given that it is the end of the school year and we know how crazy that can be for all of you. But again, if you'd have any other questions, we can stay on the line and continue to monitor those in the chat box as they come up. Otherwise, thank you for your participation. Please keep a lookout for the evaluation, and thank you in advance for completing that. Have a great day.